So I've been thinking about making this project for a while, but I wasn't entirely sure how to make it work. I've seen some other folks make beads out of plastic bottles, but I didn't love their results, and I wasn't sure if I could make a slightly different version. So this is my version of the plastic bottle beads. You can see that they're not completely uniform. Whoops. They're not completely uniform, as in they're not the perfect, all the same exact size, but I think they have a nice finished edge and a fairly uniform look to them. And I'm just going to be using a plain plastic water bottle. Now for these beads, this plastic is probably about the cheapest, thinnest plastic you can find. You probably could do this technique with heavier bottles like the liter plastic bottles and things, but for the beads that I've been making, I've just been using these very thin plastic water bottles. Also, we are going to be using an iron, so you do need to kind of melt the plastic a little bit. So you want to be in a good area with some good ventilation, and if you're worried about melting plastic, then this project might be one that you want to pass on, but we're not doing a heavy amount of melting of the plastic. You're just kind of knocking down the edges to round off the ends a little bit. And so I don't think there's going to be a lot of plastic fumes, but that's certainly a personal decision that you'll need to make for yourself. The tools I'm going to be using are a pair of scissors. I've got this little needle nose or round-tipped jewelry pliers that I'm going to be using, and I've got an X-Acto knife and a little piercing tool from the Dollar Tree. I also have a couple of wooden skewers in a couple sizes. These just kind of help hold the beads as you're working with them. It's sort of an optional thing. However you want to hold the beads, I use the pliers for that too, so you may or may not want the wooden skewers. I'm also using some 10 millimeter jump rings, and these are the rose gold color that I'm working with. And they're a good size. You could probably try some different sizes of jump rings, but the 10 millimeter seems to be a pretty good size to work with to make a fairly, they're not huge beads, but they're not tiny beads either. I'm also going to be using this UV resin from Let's Resin. And this little kit, I don't remember exactly how much it was. I think it was around $16. But it comes with the resin glue and a little UV light if you don't already have one. And the great thing about this UV pin is that you can recharge it with a USB port. So you'll always have a charge on your UV light. And whenever you're working with this glue, you do want to have some gloves. So I'll be wearing some rubber gloves. Something's leaking in here already. I can feel a little bit of the glue. So you definitely want some gloves to wear. And the last thing you're going to want is a bead roller. And if you've seen some of my other bead tutorials, you know how much I love this bead roller from Green Creativity. But actually, for this craft, I've found that this simple bead roller that I just made from an empty pen and a cotter pin is actually easier. So if you have a quilling tool or a small just handheld bead roller, I think that will work just fine for this project. So the first thing I want to do is clear off my table a little bit here. And I'm going to start with my X-Acto knife and my water bottle. And I just want to take the label off, and then I'm going to cut the bottle along this first little ridged line in my water bottle. So I'm just going to take off this label. And the fortunate thing about these water bottles is that there's very little adhesive on this label too, so the labels come off very easily. So you can see there's a lot of sort of ridges in this bottle, but the bottle also, it's kind of hard to see, but it gets a little narrower here in the center. So for the first few cuts, I'm going to take off the top of my bottle here, and it's just the easiest tool I found to use was this X-Acto knife. Need my glasses though. So I'm just going to follow this first little ridge and take the top off of the bottle. And then my bottle's a little bit wet here, so I'm just going to grab a paper towel and dry it out. And then hopefully you can see right along here, this first little ridge is pretty straight. So I'm going to cut my first piece of plastic right in that first ridge, and this dimension is 3/8 to 1/2 inch wide, and you want to stick with that dimension as much as you can. You don't have to cut the bottle perfectly, but I'm going to kind of just cut all the way down the seam here. And then I'm going to cut along that first ridge. And the first, you know, every water bottle is probably a little bit different. These are handy because you can sort of start with that first strip that's about 3/8 to 1/2 inch wide. So these first 3 cuts are kind of just right along in that indentation of the bottle. As you move down the bottle, you're going to find that you have to just try to keep the width the same and not worry about cutting across the ridges. Because you can see here they start to wave a little bit. So I'm just going to continue cutting, and as I work my way down, I'm just going to cut across those ridges instead of in the indentation, because I want to keep the width of my pieces of plastic fairly consistent. I mean, they don't have to be perfect, and they're not going to be because it's a little awkward to cut the bottle. But just do the best you can and try to keep them about 1/2 inch wide. And don't worry about whether you're cutting in the ridge once you get down to some of the more wavy portions. So the first thing I want to do is I'm going to take my bead roller, and if you have the green Creativity bead roller, it will work just fine. I do just think that this regular bead roller is a little easier to grab the plastic with when you're first starting out. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to try to roll with the curve of the plastic bottle here. So I just want to slide the plastic through the cotter pin here, and you want to leave a little bit of, I don't know which way is easier for you to see. You need to leave a little bit out of the sticking out, But you don't want to leave too much because that kind of affects how your hole will function. So you just want to kind of turn it slowly and make sure you've got a good grip. And then once you get a couple of turns, you can pull it a little tighter. And hopefully you can kind of see that even though this plastic has a big ridge in it, it's just kind of a thin enough plastic that as I'm rolling it on the bead roller, it does sort of flatten out. So I'm going to slide this up a little bit onto the tip of my bead roller here, and I want to hold it tightly. And then I'm just going to take one of my 10mm jump rings and I'm going to slide it over and kind of hold it in the middle. And then I want to kind of keep my plastic lined up as evenly as I can. And I'm going to hold the jump ring sort of in the middle while I let the plastic expand a little bit. So I'm going to let it be loose until it is held together by the jump ring. And then I can slide it off of my bead roller. And I'm just going to line up the ends again. And that's the step number 1 of rolling these plastic bottle beads. So I'm going to continue that process for my other strips here, and then we'll move on to step 2. It's not actually critical that you roll with the direction of the bottle, and if you are having trouble, sometimes the smoother the piece is, the harder it is to grab. So these little ridges kind of help you in some ways for the cotter pin to grab the plastic. But if you've broken it sort of like this, I've tried too many times and it's slid off. So you either have to take a bigger bite of plastic, which can kind of be, like I said, it sort of affects the way that your hole will work. So if you do that, I would just switch to the other side and try it. And you just want to be careful when you're first starting this coil, because you want just the littlest amount of plastic that you can get by with, but you need it to grab. So those first couple of turns you want to be kind of slow, and if you need to, you can sort of pinch the cotter pin or your bead roller, whatever you know, if you have a regular bead roller, tight together so that it will grab that piece of plastic. And then you should be able to, you know, once it grabs, it's easy to roll the whole thing together. So again, I'm just going to hold my coil tight, slide on my jump ring, and then let the coil kind of unwind. But I want to hold both sides so that the jump ring doesn't slide off. Now, because these because of the ridges and just the way the bottle's made, sometimes the very end wants to slip out. And so you want to just be careful when you're taking these off of the bead roller and making sure that they're staying, that the jump ring is sort of staying on in the center and that it's actually holding the end of the plastic. These two haven't been too awkward, but sometimes there's just a little bit of a twist in the plastic, and so you just need to make sure that you're carefully removing everything and just making it, you know, checking. And if the jump ring ends up falling off, you can just start over and recoil your plastic and slide the jump ring on again. All right, so I'm going to finish this step and then we'll be back to do step 2. All right, we're ready for step number 2, which is the gluing step. So I'm going to put my gloves on and get the resin glue out here. I did want to mention, I meant to say this earlier, thank you to Upcycling with Andrea. She sort of was the impetus for me actually finally diving in and working with some plastic. And she has her own channel if you want to check that out. She does upcycling projects too. So if you enjoy all the upcycling stuff, be sure to hop over to her channel, which is Upcycling with Andrea. All right, this is where I usually use my skewers, and I like to just kind of slide them on so that I don't have to hold them directly. And then I'm just going to put a little dot of glue. I like to put it on the seam of the jump ring, but you don't have to. And you don't have to get glue on the entire piece, but we do want to just make sure that we're securing this jump ring onto the plastic. So I just drop a little dot, dot on the seam there, and then I try to smooth it out a little bit so that it's not going to be a big glob of glue. And then your UV light just needs to go on there for about 10 seconds. And you do want to still be careful with these because they're not secured at all in the center. They could still kind of slide open. All we've done here is just make sure that that jump ring is going to stay centered on the bead. This UV glue, I do wish that it had a slightly more precise tip. What have I used? I can't think of what it is now. It's sort of a super glue that is also a resin glue. I can't think of the brand now. But it has a more precise tip on it, but it's really hard to find. And the other thing about this, it probably needs to be in a dark bottle, I'm guessing, just because, I don't know, you don't want light to get to it. But I wish there was a way to tell how much glue you had left. So I guess I'm just going to use it until the glue runs out, but I do wish that I had a slightly... I could get just a little bit less glue out, because this sometimes gets you a big glob of glue, and that's why you kind of need to smooth it out here so you don't have a bump, of glue, of hard resin when you're done. But like I said, you only need to secure it in one spot. You don't have to secure it all the way around. You can just do a quick little dot of glue and then spread it out a little bit just to hold that jump ring on to the plastic. Oh, see what I mean? I wasn't careful enough, so that one just came undone. So probably I'm going to have to just toss that one because I already put the resin glue on there. So, as I said, be careful when you're removing them. All right, I'm ready for the final and finishing step, and I'm going to go ahead and plug my iron in, and I just have it on the highest heat setting. You can play around with yours if you don't, if you think that's too hot or it's melting your plastic too quickly. But for this step, I'm going to use my piercing tool and my jewelry pliers, and I'm just gonna set my iron up here. So I'm gonna take the first bead and I'm just gonna grab it with my round tipped jewelry pliers, and hopefully you can kind of see that there's a little bit of variation in the width of the plastic, so it's made sort of a uneven end to the bead. So the first thing I'm going to do is just set it on the iron flat, and then I like to kind of just round the edges. So you can iron these kind of as much or as little as you want to. I've found that this does kind of secure the plastic, but your beads can still come uncoiled. So you do want to treat them kind of gently, and if you have gotten them to be the perfect shape that you like, and they're still kind of sliding apart and you don't want them to, you could probably add some of the resin glue to the very end here and kind of finish that off too, just to hold it. Sometimes the iron will fuse the plastic together and actually kind of hold the bead solidly, and sometimes you're just going to have a bead that still kind of can shift because not every single coil has been solidly fused. Now this one seems fairly secure, and the hole is nice and even in this one. Sometimes, just depending on how large the hole is when you start, and the ripples that are in the piece of plastic, you can kind of close off the end, and that's why I have the piercing tool. So if you fuse the plastic too much flat like this, you can kind of end up closing off the hole, which is why I like to do just a little bit, and then I just try to round off the edges. And it doesn't take very long. You probably don't want to use your fancy new iron, but I have a older one that I just use for crafting, so I'm not too worried about getting any plastic onto the surface of my iron. So you can also clean your iron, but I recommend using a dedicated crafting iron. And I don't particularly love the fact that I'm melting plastic, so I try to do this step as quickly as I can. But that is all there is to it. And then I think you get a bead that has a nice finished sort of rounded edge to it. And you know it's going to stay together because you've got your jump ring around there. So you've got a nice solid bead to work with. So I'm going to finish up these beads, but stay tuned for a future video. I'm working on some different ways to color the bottles to come up with colored beads. And in a future video, we'll be making some actual jewelry items with these beads. But today, I just wanted to quickly go over this technique for making this sort of plastic and metal combination of beads. So if you enjoyed today's video, be sure to click that like button. If you haven't already, I'd love for you to join my YouTube community. And if you're interested, you can check the description box for a place to sign up to receive the Upcycled Design Lab newsletter. Thanks so much for watching. I look forward to seeing you in the next video.